Welcome, school principals and district administrators from across the U.S. My name is Sean Smith, and I am a former teacher, assistant principal, and chief of schools for our nation's third largest school system. I will be moderating a brand new series for Modern Teacher, building a personalized learning ecosystem in the classroom and at home. Today's episode will focus on choices for instructional design. You will receive a certificate of completion for this webinar at the end of today's presentation by accessing the handouts in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The certificate will be available on slide 2 of the handout. You can stay connected to us on Twitter by following us at Modern Teacher Co. If you experience any technical issues during today's webinar, we recommend that you exit out of the webinar and then come back in through the provided link. If that does not work, try restarting your computer. And finally, you can always get the webinar on demand afterwards. I am joined by two amazing teachers and leaders today. Lizette Casey is coming to you from her home in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and Dr. Ann Chavez, who will be moderating our chat, is coming to us from her home in Henderson, Nevada. We are thrilled to welcome you to MT On Demand. MT On Demand is a webinar channel created to deliver anywhere, anytime access to best practices to putting the learner at the center of instructional design and delivery. We have designed content with two purposes in mind: building leadership capacity in change management and systems thinking to achieve instructional transformation at scale, and building teacher proficiency in personalized, blended, and competency-based learning. This series is designed to help you seamlessly transition between classroom instruction and virtual learning. In case you missed it, this is episode 4, and our previous episodes, we encourage you to access them on demand by visiting modernteacher.com. All of our episodes are grounded in Modern Teacher's professional learning modules. Our modules are designed to be interactive and engaging and self-paced. Each module contains real-world simulations, taking you inside classrooms to practice some of the concepts we explore in the web series. We blend these self-paced modules with real-time, face-to-face webinars custom designed for your school or district. In this web series, Building a Personalized Learning Ecosystem, we will be diving into 3 specific modules in the Modern Teacher Professional Learning Platform: architecting a modern curriculum that allows you to design learning experiences in the classroom or at home, architecting rigorous learning experiences so kids are prepared for today's world, and architecting digital and face-to-face learning experiences so you can seamlessly move from classroom instruction to virtual learning. At the end of this episode, today's presentation will pop up in the right-hand corner of your screen and be available for download and use. So let's get started. You can see here that this graphic on your screen grounds our thinking about today's world. We are going to be diving in specifically today around several components of this particular graphic. We believe that the 4 building blocks for building out a personalized learning ecosystem starts with the concept of the learner, then creates strong instructional design that's built inside a digital ecosystem that allows for a myriad of choices of instructional delivery. Today's episode focuses on learner-centered instructional design. In other words, we're going to help unpack and build learning plans for use in the classroom and playlists for use during remote learning. We're also going to take these learning plans and build out larger units of study. Today's work in this visual focuses on curriculum, learning plans, and playlists. You can see here the way we think about this. If you missed the first 2 episodes of this web series, you can access them at modernteacher.com on demand. In the previous episodes, we focused on building out a learner profile, understanding the continuum of learning, and how to break down that continuum of learning into competencies, learning progressions, and proficiency scales. Now, we're going to take that continuum of learning and start to think about how we actually design instruction, tasks and experiences for kids that bring to life the curriculum. So let's get started in today's webinar. We're focusing here on learner-centered instructional design. But before we dive into learning plans and playlists, we need to talk a little bit about how we think about grouping these into units of study. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lizette, who's going to walk us through different ways to think about grouping standards together into a unit of study. Lizette, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. So in previous episodes, as Sean mentioned, we reviewed and discussed the concept of a learning playlist. Typically at this point in time, teachers may be working to build out those playlists for each of the standards that they are getting ready to engage their students with. In a typical world, a teacher would then take these learning playlists that they've created and group them into units of study. And units of study typically include standards that are grouped together in a way that makes sense to teach. Units of study can be topical, skills-based, or thematic. Topical units of study are typically focused on specific portions of a larger subject or discipline, and often include things in math like place value, equivalency. You can see how the buildup of science and social studies and ELA topical unit of studies play out. You can also group your standards by skills. That's a skill-based unit of study that emphasizes a skill or an application. In this case, in math, it could be regrouping, convergence, measurement, science, inquiry, scientific process. Any content area can be project-based, can involve design thinking. And finally, you have a thematic unit of study, which typically are pretty broad in nature and emphasize the connections to other topics, maybe within that particular discipline or a completely different discipline. Thematic units may be referred to as integrated units, cross-disciplinary units, and often encompass broader subjects like conflict resolution, change, interdependence. Typically, in social studies, you'll see a lot of these being content-specific. Social studies tends to lend itself very nicely to thematic units of study. After the standards that make up a unit are identified, the next step is to determine how you want to sequence the standards within the unit and approach the teaching of that particular unit. Unless the teacher is adhering to a district pacing guide, there are a variety of ways to approach this. Listed here are several different configurations that can be used, between running from chronological all the way to simple to complex. These are listed alphabetically, and in no way do they state that this is the best way at the top and that you work your way down from the bottom. So this is completely up to what makes sense to the teacher or the curriculum and instruction team that may be actually writing the units of study. So here's a couple examples of some unit plans that, or units of study that have grouped standards together. And this is where it's really important that a clear unit vision is something that the district has thought about. This is an example of a unit plan that is taken from a common unit plan template that's utilized in all areas, all content areas, K-12 within a district. This idea of a unit plan template that's common among these content areas allows for more effective and consistent organization of units from classroom to classroom. In this case, this is an example of a second grade topical unit of study focused on the structure and function of government. You can see on the left that the teachers identified the standards that are to be taught in this unit. And then when you move into the unit plan on the right, it's the very first piece of information that you see are those identified standards. And then they link out to the learning plans or playlists affiliated with those specific standards. The essential questions or the big ideas They're often dependent upon how the district wants to express those in their unit plan, are typically related to the standards that are being taught in that unit. And then in this case, the skills and dispositions, often related to a graduate profile, are identified so that by the end of the year, a district can be certain each student has the exposure to those identified skills and dispositions that they expect as they work their way K-12 towards that graduate profile. Typically then, when you group standards into a unit of study, you want to relate your pre-assessments and post-assessments. Any formative assessments would also go in here if a district is identifying those common assessments. And again, those assessments are related to that specific standard at hand. So when you're grouping those standards, you want to really think about how you're going to assess, pre-assess, and post-assess. And then finally, you have the culminating activity. That culminating activity could directly relate to the deeper learning section of a proficiency scale, as we talked about earlier. And it's here that the skills and dispositions, the use of rigor and 21st century skill frameworks can push the critical thinking and the application of knowledge as students engage in real world, authentic examples of activities that relate to those standards as they're grouped together. So I'm going to give you another example, unless Sean.
Yeah, no, this is really good. And so one of the things I was kind of thinking about for our audience, if you haven't seen our previous webinars in this web series, Building Out a Personalized Learning Ecosystem, we started with this concept of a continuum of learning. So we took a content area and we took all of the standards across that content area from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, and we chunked them into strands, and then we built out the entire standards all the way for a student's experience from kindergarten through 12th grade. Once that has been done, and we talked about that extensively in a previous episode, now what you're saying is we then have to decide in instructional design how we're going to chunk and group those standards into units of study. So you've told us that we could do it thematically, interdisciplinary, by content area, by skills and dispositions. Once I decide that, once our district or our school or at the classroom level, depending on how you guys make decisions, once I do that, I then group standards together in units of study. And the standards that are grouped together then are framed with essential questions and typically culminate with some type of authentic learning experience that delves deeper into solving real world problems, having students take on an authentic role in society, connected to maybe some things in our graduate profile or 21st century skills. And then what's going to play out here in subsequent slides that we're going to take people through is how you actually then scaffold and build individual lessons around the greater whole. Did I summarize that correctly, just to kind of ground where we're at in this?
Perfectly. Yes, thank you. So we can kind of take that summary and apply it to the next slide here, which is just a different example of a district unit plan. In this case, it's centered around 4 standards in math and 3rd grade math that are listed on the left. And this particular unit of study is on measurement and data. And you can see here the unit title, Measurement and Data, Time, Volume, Mass, Length, and Graphs. And in this particular unit, skill-based unit, kids are engaging and actually doing a lot of measurement as it relates to these different types of areas. So again, here we have the standards, which depend again on the teacher. And typically, again, when you look at that section where the unit standards and the linked learning plans are located in the center of the document there, those are organized by the teacher or by the district, depending upon who's actually writing the curriculum. And should always kind of consist, like when you're thinking about organizing these standards and grouping them together, and then the sequence in which they are to be taught really should be a mix and incorporate a mix of constructivist, inquiry-based, and directed instruction pedagogies. Not necessarily always the pathway identified in a textbook. We just want to make sure that the goal is to connect the standards to relevant, authentic learning experiences that students might see in the real world. On page 2 of this unit plan, which you're not seeing, is also a section that allows for student reflection. And this is something that a lot of districts will tend to do when they group standards together, is provide a time for students to a time and space for students to reflect on how they're performing and how they can independently learn. And that learning plan or a playlist that we're going to get into ties into that. So I wanted to kind of connect that reflection for learning back to what we're going to be discussing in a little bit around those playlists. Again, finally, I think as you think about this, successful teachers who use these design approaches are constantly iterating on their practice and are easily adapting and utilizing learning pathways based on formative data, as well as what's working and what isn't working in the classroom. So that awareness of your pre-assessments, whether it's a post-assessment and then formative assessments that are identified in your unit plan, will play a big piece of how you're looking at kids progressing through that particular unit.
Want to kind of talk about is after the unit has been developed in terms of chunking standards together, we have to think about our learning plans and our playlists. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about how I use those terms. A learning plan is something that a student has choice in. And so we're giving students choice and agency within the pathway that the teacher has laid out. And kids have multiple choices in that. I like to use the term learning plan when kids are working inside the classroom within a unit of study, and they have choices around several different aspects of their learning. I use the term playlist when we have integrated and linked out to a lot of digital content. And a playlist is similar to a learning plan, except that we have lots of opportunities for engagement within digital content. And a playlist can be delivered outside of the classroom for remote learning as well. But you actually can use that playlist inside the classroom, depending on how you're thinking about instructional delivery. So we're going to walk you through learning plans and playlists today. And one of the things that we want to think about is, as we design instruction, how are we going to deliver that instruction? And in episodes coming up, we have an entire episode devoted to instructional delivery choices. We want to just quickly walk you through a handful of ideas, because the design of how we scaffold learning matters when we think about the interconnectivity of instructional delivery. So there are multiple ways that you can think about delivering instruction, and how you design instruction matters in that context. One of those ways, and increasingly more for folks, is this idea of remote learning. This gives students the opportunities to work on standards outside of the traditional classroom. Cooperative groups could happen in a remote learning setting or inside the classroom. Gives kids the opportunity to work with other students at different ability levels. It promotes cooperation and collaboration. It actively engages kids in the learning process, and it can be utilized across content areas. Learning centers or workstations could reflect the idea that our physical classroom can be broken up into different stations to give kids the opportunities to practice, enrich, and or enhance learning independently or with a small group. It can contain all the instructional tools students might need to engage in the learning experience independently or in small groups. It can actively engage kids in hands-on learning experiences. And again, it can also be utilized across content areas. Some folks think about designing instruction in a workshop model. We think about the components of a workshop model being a mini lesson directed by the teacher, work time that's independent, guided, collaborative, and offers opportunities for conferencing, and then share time for kids. This minimizes the amount of time the teacher spends at the front of the room teaching whole group, allows time for the facilitation of small group instruction, and again, can be utilized across content areas. Of late, there is a model called flipped learning. That's generally students will get the direct instruction or the knowledge part of standards, typically at home via an online video. And it could be recorded lectures, videos that they see. And the teacher will use the time in class for guided practice, deeper learning, authentic tasks, activities or projects. It minimizes the time spent on traditional lectures and focuses that outside of the classroom. Again, another design model that ultimately leads to instructional delivery. We have station rotation as a design model. Students can rotate on a fixed schedule, say every 15 minutes or 30 minutes. They'll go through each of the different stations. Students will experience all of the stations. They're not all teacher-led, and they all might have a little bit of a different focus. Typically, stations are differentiated and eventually personalized as the teacher advances through some of the more advanced playlist or learning plan templates that we're going to show you. There's also individual rotation. So kids don't necessarily have to go through the station rotation by group. They can actually go through it on an individual basis. This doesn't necessarily have to be timed at every station. Kids could have a lot more choices based on this, and it could actually fulfill the learning plans. And we're going to show you some really great examples of how to use this design model in your thinking when you're building out learning plans and playlists. So when I think about designing for instruction, in other words, I've got my unit of study, I've grouped our standards, I'm now going to build lessons to engage kids in the curriculum, multiple ways that I have to think about designing inside of my classroom and then ultimately outside of my classroom for remote, virtual, or distance learning.
So I just wanted to say a little bit about this slide. One of the things that we really want to do is expose people to the many different options that Sean just discussed here. And this slide here sums them all up in one particular slide. What we don't want to have happen when we're actually in class together physically is for the time that kids are working through, whether it's cooperative learning or workstation, station rotation, any of these models here, design models, we don't want it to turn into sort of a study hall where the teacher is not really engaging with kids. So as kids are working in these particular, through these particular stations, the teacher then is often pulling small group. So the first thing we have to do is really kind of take a look and say, we need to skill ourselves on what these models actually entail. So this slide is really the opportunity for all of you. It will be linked in the slide deck that you received to actually engage and take a look at some of these different types of models and build awareness of those models for yourself and your staff. So that they can start to incorporate them into their classroom, try them out, see what works best for them.
What we want to really underscore here is in an episode coming up, we're going to talk about instructional delivery, and we're going to dive deep into all of these examples. But it's so interconnected how you design instruction that gives you the flexibility for a myriad of choices around instructional delivery. So design and delivery are always linked. Today, we're focusing on how to design instruction that gives you lots of options for instructional delivery. So let's dive into it. So a learning plan or a playlist. Again, I like to use the term learning plan when I'm designing for choices for kids inside the classroom. I use the term playlist when I'm pushing out to remote or virtual learning. Although when it's linked, a set of experiences and tasks to digital content, I can still use that playlist inside the classroom as well. 5 big sections comprise our learning plan or our playlist. The standard or group of standards that we're working on, the learning progression, and then 3 big sections where my teaching happens. learn about it, practice it, and show my evidence of learning. So let's dive in a little bit to what this looks like. So in this particular template that you're seeing, what you see here highlighted in the learning plan or the playlist is the standard. And in this particular case, we're looking at exponents for the standard. So here at the very top, all of my learning plans are always linked to a standard. What is it that I want my kids to be able to know and do? In a previous episode, we taught how to take a standard from the continuum of learning and unpack it by breaking it down into very specifically, what do we want kids to know and what do we want them to be able to do? If you remember correctly, we take this unpacked standard and then start to build out learning progressions and proficiency scales. And that will show up in my learning plan. So step number one, the standard anchors my learning plan or group of standards together. I unpack the standard by breaking it down into what I want kids to know and explicitly what I want them to do. This next part then takes the information of what I want kids to know and be able to do when the standard's unpacked, and I build out a learning progression. In a previous episode, you can access this at modernteacher.com on demand. You can see us teach how to break down the standard into learning progressions and then build out the proficient level, the emerging level, and the developing level. And I can break out what I want kids to know and be able to do. That shows up in my learning plan. So I have very specifically what I want kids to know and be able to do. One thing we always get is, why do we actually build out learning progressions? Why do we take the standard and actually break it down into not only what we want kids to know and be able to do, but scaffold it for rigor? And we talked about this idea that at the core of learning plans and learning progressions is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is the in-between zone of the student's actual instructional or developmental level with their potential, what they can actually learn based on their background knowledge, what they can do independently, with a little bit of teacher strategies and assistance. That ZPD, that zone of proximal development, is a student's sweet spot for instruction. That's their instructional level. And then if it's too far out advanced, it's problems that cannot be solved even with assistance. By allowing us to break down the standard into learning progressions, we are able to place each child exactly where they are within that standard based on Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So you can see here that I've taken out, in this particular example of my learning plan, I've taken the standard and I've broken the standard into what we want kids to know and be able to do. That's my learning progression. And I've also divided that into proficient, developing, and emerging. That's the next part of the learning plan or the playlist. Any other things to add on this, Lizette?
Yeah, I think I wanted to say a big piece of this learning plan is that it is a student-facing document, and it is a clear purpose of that is to let students own their learning and realize where they are in their particular learning as it relates to that standard. So students know where they're entering in, and they know what they're striving for. I think that's a key piece there as teachers begin to design these learning plans, that they are student-facing for the purpose of increasing the transparency of learning.
Perfect. So what's the next part then of the learning plan? Well, now in the learning plan, I've got my standard. I've broken the standard into what we want kids to know and be able to do. In an early part of the process, sometimes you can just write the learning progression to the proficient level, which is the level of mastery for the standard. In other cases, you might want to break that down or scaffold that down into developing and emerging. We call this part our advanced playlist. We call this part our intermediate playlist, depending on where you're at in the journey. And then it's all about the 3 parts of instructional design: learn about it, practice it, show my evidence of learning. So in this next part here, I've got resources that I've built out for the learn about it section. In the learn about it section, This is core instruction. This tends to be teacher-directed lessons. They can be whole group, they can be small group, they can be mini lessons, but it's ultimately where the teacher is providing some instruction. If you're in class, a teacher may be going through some direct instruction here. If it's a playlist, you may actually have a set of digital experiences or digital content that a student could go through independently to learn about this particular standard. And then in some design choices, if kids are getting remote learning, a teacher might choose to synchronously Zoom in or Hangout Meets in and actually teach this virtual face-to-face live. So this first part is the Learn About It section. In the Learn About It section, it typically has the resources for students to learn the content and the processes outlined in the standard. Resources could be online or teacher-created videos. They could be digital or printed articles, magazines, books. It could be specific pages of a textbook. Lots of different ways to think about the Learn About It section. The next section in my learning planner playlist is the Practice It. So after kids have had a chance to engage in the content of what they're learning, they now have to have a set of experiences to practice and use that knowledge. So the practice section has not just digital content, it's not just videos, but things for kids to do. They need to engage in this now. They need to take the information and they need to begin to wrestle with it. And so there's a lot of different things that kids can do in the practice section. It could be games, it could be digital flashcards, it could be interactive notebook entries or journaling. It could be some workbook pages, depending on your district's instructional materials. The Practice It section should include resources for kids to engage with the content that they've learned in the Learn About It section. Tasks that won't be graded should be included here. It's the practice before the actual big game. So that's the next part of my learning planner playlist. Now, I bet you're thinking this is exactly why the instructional design is so related to instructional delivery. There are lots of ways to bring the Practice It section to life inside the classroom or outside the classroom. And that's why we started today with framing all of these different delivery models: station rotation, individual rotation, cooperative groups, workshop model, remote learning. So I'm sure you're already thinking about so many different ways in your classroom or increasingly more outside of your classroom where you could design a set of experiences for kids to practice the Learn About It section. Was that anything we should add here before we move on to the next part?
I think just that as you're thinking about the experiences that kids are going to engage with as it relates to Practice It, even the Learn About It section, that you want to consider the different modalities of learning your kids have based on that learner profile that we talked about earlier, and provide opportunities where it's not just all text related or it's not all game based, but you have a variety there, because choice is a key piece here. You may expect kids to do 3 out of 6. Things like that. And then the other piece I would add is as you begin to build these learning plans for the first time, you're going to see a template that might have 6 boxes. It's okay to only have 2 or 3 experiences as you start this. These are things that are going to grow as you use these learning plans, and as even maybe sometimes kids discover sites that they found helpful. That's great.
And the one thing I would add, here is an example in the Practice It section. These tasks and experiences might all be tasks designed at the proficient level. We consider this our intermediate template. Our advanced template would actually take these 3 learning progression levels, proficient, developing, and emerging, and align tasks in the Practice It section for each level. So you might have 2 Practice It experiences at the developing level, 2 at the proficient level, and kids have some choices. So different ways to kind of think about that as you're building out instructional design around this. So again, we've got the Learn About It and then the Practice It. Anything you wanted to add, Bill, is that?
just that's why it becomes so important to unpack that standard and really understand what's expected at the proficient level and what's expected at that developing level. So that practice in and of itself is so helpful, as you then can look at the resources that you're aligning with the practice it, so that you're sure you're actually incorporating your resource that hits to the level of that standard or hits to the developing level of the standard.
Okay, and then the third part, or the last part of the actual instructional piece of the learning plan, is our evidence of learning. So here, this is where we only build out the proficient level at the beginning of this to show your evidence of learning, because here's where kids are going to actually show you that they've actually mastered the standard. And so typically we still have some choices within the evidence of learning section. You might say, all right, here's 3 different choices to show your evidence. I'm requiring you to do this one, and of the other 2, pick one. So lots of ways that give kids some voice in this and some choice as it relates. In our evidence of learning, this is typically where we will now make an assessment. It can be a formative assessment to say that they've mastered the standard within the unit. The evidence section should include opportunities for kids to show that they've mastered the content, both what you want them to know and what you want them to be able to do. Different ways to reach different modalities, creating an infographic, visual presentation, screencast, PowerPoint presentations. They could create an artifact, written artifacts, diary entries, essays, articles. It could be a test or a quiz, depending on that. And we like to see a myriad of choices within this section. Any other thoughts on this, Lizette, building out the learning plan?
I think sometimes a lot of people will ask me, can I put a developing section in evidence of learning? And that's perfectly acceptable if, this is a great starting place. But if you have the time and interest to develop that developing section, you can kind of think of that as the prerequisite or exit ticket for the student who is working at that developing level to then move into the proficient practice activities.
Let's reframe what Lizette said. That's a really important piece here. So kids that are doing practice it activities I'm going to go back to that slide so everybody can see it. Kids that are doing practice it activities in the developing part of the learning progression on this standard. If you choose to build out an evidence of learning section for the developing progression, once the kids have demonstrated that they have successfully accomplished the developing part of that standard, they then work their way into the practice it and learn about it sections of the proficient level, because we still ultimately have to scale them up to the proficiency of the standard. And that's when they'll start doing activities associated with practice it for the actual proficient level. And then they still have to actually do the assessment to show their evidence of learning in the proficient level. So great way to connect those two, Lizette. Some good examples. And for a lot of kids, this scaffolding is really important. And that's why we think building these things out matter with that. So that's great. Lizette, let's talk a little bit about using learning plans. So you had mentioned that learning plans are student-facing documents. It's that transparency of where they're at in the learning process, where they're at in the unit of study, and giving them choices within this. So how would I actually teach kids how to use this learning plan?
So the first thing I would say is with patience, because remember, the first time kids use something, it doesn't always go as smoothly as you think, and you tend to want to give up because they say they can't do it. So the first place to start is to realize that this is a process for kids, and this is a very unusual method of kids working through their learning. Typically, it's the teacher always telling the kids what to do, and they've grown quite accustomed to that. So it's very, very important to teach them how to do that. And we really do need to take time more than once to provide some direct instruction on the different parts of the learning plan and model how to use that plan. And typically that is best served in a small group when you're actually introducing the learning plan to the students. You may introduce the concept of learning plans and a different design model to them as you kind of start whole group. But then when kids are working through their rotations or whatever model you're doing, that direct instruction piece on that learning plan will be important to kind of show them how to use it. And then start with a standard that you're working through at that moment and work through the skill together using that learning plan in your small group. Notice, underline that important vocabulary just like we did. We talked about, okay, here's the standard, here's the proficiency scale, here's what it means to be able to show your, to do what you can do. And then again, with them, make sure they understand the verbiage in that proficiency scale. So that you grow as you grow with writing these, you'll grow with making them student friendly, but it's really important students understand what they are being expected to know and do. And then finally, as kids are starting to work through learning plans, you want to begin that personalized ownership of those learning plans with kids and asking, getting feedback on them. Asking them, if kids are kind of working through that learning plan, was there another site that you felt helped you learn about it more? So providing a little bit of time for kids to explore the learning plan and then have some voice in the learning plan will become important, because the more you do that, the more ownership they take over the learning plan, the more they realize they're able to better set their own pace as they progress.
That's great. And then typically we would have multiple learning plans in a unit of study that kids are having choice around in a given time period. And so that becomes important as well. What we've got here for folks in the presentation are examples of this. So you probably want to see kind of what this looks like. So we have, when the handout becomes available and you get to this slide in the handout, we have linked to examples of an 8th grade math learning plan playlist, a 7th grade science, and a 6th grade social studies. So you can see here 3 great learning plan examples as you kind of think about this. Was that anything else to add on this part?
No, I think it's pretty self-explanatory as you go in and take a look at those.
Again, also, we're going to link out to templates for you. So when you think about building a learning plan, we've already got these templates available. Remember, there were 5 big parts of the learning plan: the standard, the learning progression, learn about it, practice it, show my evidence of learning. And then based on your comfort level with these learning plans, you could scaffold instruction and build out more learning progressions, or just stay right at the standard proficient level. So lots of ways to kind of think about that, which is pretty great. So we'll link you out to this as well so that you can have these templates available. We also have lots of great examples of this coming to life on Pinterest. So if you look at Modern Teacher on Pinterest, we've got some great examples of this, and we would encourage you to take a look at Pinterest as well. So we talked about in this series, this entire series is all about a personalized learning ecosystem. We started with the concept of the learner profile, built out a continuum of learning, understood how to unpack standards within the continuum of learning, building out learning progressions, proficiency scales within the standards, and then now starting to think about grouping standards together into units of study. And then within the unit, building learning plans and playlists that allow for differentiated choice and personalization. The other thing that the playlist and the instructional design does, as we begin to build out this design inside a digital ecosystem, which is our next episode, it will then give you lots of choices for instructional delivery. The idea that you can truly move seamlessly from the virtual classroom to the actual physical classroom. And what I want to do is I'm going to take us back really quickly to this slide, because I think it frames lots of good thinking for teachers. As you're thinking about your learning plans and playlists, if kids become familiar with the routines and the cadence of the learning plan, that's a document for kids. As they become familiar with it, whether you have options for kids that particular day for cooperative groups or centers or workstations or a workshop model, or you immediately have to shut down in-person learning at school and move to remote learning, kids will have that flow and that confidence to move their way through the learning plan, whether they're in the classroom doing one of these design models or whether they're remote, because they're familiar with it. And in our learning plans, when we build them out into playlists, kids go through the learning plan just like they do when they're at home. They go through, learn about it, practice it, show my evidence of learning. And they're very, very familiar with that. So in our instructional delivery episode, we will dive in to lots of ways to bring this to life, which is pretty exciting. All right, you can visit Modern Teacher on demand, and you can see episodes 2 and 3 on demand. We will also have this episode, episode 4, available on demand as well. Our next episode, episode 5, will dive into creating all of the necessary digital tools and connecting all of the tools that you have at your disposal into an ecosystem that is learner-centered. And then finally, we're going to go through lots of different options once we've designed our instruction and built out our technology tools for choices around instructional delivery. And that will be episode 6 of this webinar series. This all connects back, if you are a district administrator or a school-based administrator, to the framework that Modern Teacher has written for how to actually make the change happen within your school or your district. Because we believe that there are 6 big overarching drivers of our system that need to evolve to allow for this seamless transition between classroom instruction and remote learning. We talked about this idea that in our new normal, we have to build out a new vision for our instructional model. And that vision for the classroom of the future probably has some components where the learners are having choices and having agency in a physical classroom, and choices for kids to be able to access content, standard, and learning experiences outside of the classroom. And we really blur the lines between those two. That is a new definition of what we would consider an instructional model. To do that, however, we have to rewrite and evolve the curriculum. And that's what we were talking about today regarding instructional design and units of study. That curriculum is modernized when we have a pathway to reimagine how we create it, how we align it, how we integrate it with today's technology tools, and ultimately how kids can access it. And access becomes important because it is a curriculum that is transparent, and kids can access the curriculum at their instructional level and anywhere, anytime they are. And that becomes important. And this ultimately disrupts time, place, path, and pace. And that's what we're ultimately trying to do in the vision of modern learning. So again, our episode series all around building out a personalized learning ecosystem for today's world. And that's what changes the way we're thinking about this and ultimately building out these tools. If you are in the Modern Teacher Network, we know that you are deep in the weeds of this work, and we love hearing so many examples from our folks all across the country. If you are joining us today and you are not in the network, we would love to invite you into this national network. It is a movement of thinkers and people that are redesigning for the future. It's a movement that is all built on the foundational principles of kids need access to personalized learning. The learning has to be blended in today's world. We know that the learning has to be inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. And at the foundation of all of this, it is built on competencies for kids. And that's what this is all about. This movement and this network is all about. We'd encourage you to reach out to us. You can visit modernteacher.com/membership to find out more about how to become a district or a school-based member. We've got lots of folks we'd love to introduce you to, and we'd love to give you more information. So there's a form on here. You can fill out information, and one of us will be in touch within 24 hours of you submitting that. So that's a great way to think about this. How we support people in our annual membership. We have lots of leadership coaching around how to lead this work, rolling out professional learning plans, building out a robust digital ecosystem, and communicating and engaging your stakeholders in this vision of the new normal. And then we have tons of content and teacher professional learning about building out proficiency in this new model. Our modules are aligned to this content. We have reflection and coaching tools, micro certifications and badges, and a huge resource library of so many examples around this content. So again, if you want to become or get more information about how to become a member at the district or school level, modernteacher.com/membership.